Peace everyone, Unmask here, and in today's video I am going to talk about creating the illusion of light in your artwork. Now, light is a subject that a lot of people assume is very complex and difficult to learn, but I'm going to talk you through a little bit of very basic concepts of creating light in your artwork, identifying the light source, and it's really going to help you establish that three-dimensional quality in your realism. Today I'll be painting this reference here in oil paint. I did a live stream of this painting as well. If you want to watch the whole thing in real time, you can find that on my channel. But I wanted to talk about the process of taking the light information from the reference photo and then applying that to my artwork. And there's rather a very simple systematic way of approaching objects like this, whether it's just a simple still life setup like this, or it's a little bit more complex, or a landscape or a portrait. Really, you can take this approach and apply it across all different genres of artwork. So the first thing that you want to get familiar with is being able to identify the light source. And by looking at this picture, just take a moment, pause the video if you want, and decide where the light is coming from before I tell you where the light is coming from. Okay, so if you've taken a couple seconds to identify the light source, I'm going to show you where it's coming from. So the light source is coming from this direction here. Not only is it coming from the top right down to the bottom left, but it's also sort of positioned in front of the objects. So it's sort of coming down and away from you. The easiest way to tell direction of the light is by looking at cast shadows. You can see that the cast shadows from my objects are pointing across the flat surface, sort of away from you slightly, and then to the left. So that tells us that the light sources can be no more than around here and then in front of the objects a little bit as it's pushing the shadow behind them and then down. Another key feature of the cast shadows tell you how high the light is, or the sort of the sun position in the sky. So you can see that these cast shadows are not very long, so that tells us that the light source is more straight above as opposed to being at a long angle. If we were to have an object like this and the light source is here, the cast shadow could be no longer than this. But if the light source was over here, the cast shadow would be really long. And so that tells you the positioning as far as how straight down it is versus how much from the side it is. So that's the very first skill you want to practice getting familiar with. You want to be careful when choosing the reference photos that you practice this concept with, because a lot of photos will have multiple light sources, and those can be a little trickier to determine what the light is doing when a photographer usually takes like a product photo or a studio portrait. Generally, the idea is to remove as many shadows as possible, and oftentimes that uses 3 and sometimes even more lights to do that. So when you choose your reference photos, make sure that you can clearly identify the light sources. Whether there's 1, 2, 3 light sources, just make sure that you're able to identify them. And that's going to go a long way, just being able to do that. Now, the next step to creating a really effective identifiable light is to separate shadows from light. And what I mean by that is everything that is in shadow, that is the light is being blocked. If you can identify those shapes, then almost all of the work is done for you. But it can be a little tricky sometimes to identify those shapes, and it will take some practice. So for instance, I did this as an example. Here are the shapes of the guy on the left and the pawn. So I've marked everything in blue that is in shadow. Everything else is being hit by the light in spite of the subtle variation of value. All of the space in blue is the light is being blocked. And this is something that you want to practice, because if I remove the reference photo, you can see how much information the shadow itself gives you. Simply because everything else is being lit, the shadow not being lit, it gives you almost all of the information you need to establish the light source. If you were to look at this picture, you could probably just as clearly identify the light source as you could from the original reference photo. And by establishing just this broad general shape, isolating all of the shadow, simultaneously you also isolate the light, because the shadow is determined by the light. And so really you only need to identify the shadow in order to create the light. And then the next step of the process, of course, is creating form shadow, which is just a fancy word for gradient. So I'm going to get started on the painting here, and you'll see how I fill in the shadow shapes, and then I fill in the light areas, and then I create the form shadows using gradients. So like I said before, the first step that I take in the painting is to establish the shadows. Now, in this case, I'm not establishing the shadows as just one singular value, as I showed in the Photoshop example. Instead, I have two distinct values for the shadows. I have the extreme shadows, which are essentially black areas, and then I have the moderate shadows that are just the dark gray. Now, I'm not painting this in color. This is just a black and white painting, but you'll see just how effective establishing the shadows can be in simplifying the painting overall. The other thing that I'm not concerned about at this stage is the gradients. So I'm working with oil paint here, which allows me to add the gradients later on, which is a little bit different than if you're working with pastels or colored pencils, but the concept is the same regardless of the medium. Now that I have the shadows placed, I come back through and I start filling in the value for the light areas of the figure. I just work on one portion of the painting at a time. It doesn't take very long to already have the light for this figure and the pawn he's holding established. And there's just 3 values here. I have that dark value for the black areas, and then the moderate shadow for the rest of the shadows. There's no other values included, and then just one singular value for the light. Now that I have those 2 portions filled in, the shadows and the light, this is where I come back through and begin adding the gradients or the form shadows. This is what creates the three-dimensional look of the object. I paint this rather quickly, so in no way am I going for perfection here. I was truthfully in a little bit of a rush to finish this, in spite of the fact that I ended up streaming around 5 hours, I think, to finish this painting in a single sitting. But you can see that just by establishing the shadows and the lights, and then creating some of the form shadows, the figure becomes much more three-dimensional. now I start working on the second pawn and the second figure. The process is identical. I fill in the shadows and then I fill in the lights. I just do the pawn first before moving on to the figurine. But you can see, rather simple. Shadows, lights, gradients, and then I do a couple highlights there to make it look reflective. And then moving on to the figure, same exact process, using the dark values to fill in the shadows of the object. Once again, this process is rather simplistic. Once the shadows are filled in, I come back through with my light value. And once I fill in the light value, I start adding the gradients or the form shadows, or creating the form shadows, which is just that gradient range that goes from the shadow to the light. And once again, it immediately makes the figure look more three-dimensional. After I have the figures filled in, I put in their cast shadow on the ground. This further establishes the light direction, makes it a little bit more clear to the viewer, and I fill in the surface in which they are sitting on. Now the rest of the painting is just me filling in the background, so there's not a whole lot left to discuss, but as you can see, with just a very basic, simple technique, the figurines look three-dimensional, the light source is established, and overall the process is remarkably simple. When you simplify light in this way, you are able to create images like this with minimal effort, and you don't need years of experience in order to do this. You can make simple paintings like this, start establishing the fundamentals and your understanding of how light works and how it makes objects appear 3D, and then apply it to your artwork. And you will immediately see a drastic improvement in the quality of your work. And here's the finished painting. All right, so to finish up this video, I'm just going to show you a few paintings that I've done in this exact method, just to show you some variation of light and objects. So here's obviously the painting that I just did. Here's another one with just some simple shapes. And again, the light source, very well established, identifiable, very basic, simple shaped painting, but it helps to do this over and over again. Here's another one with the figures, and this one's probably one of my favorites that I did. I think the light came out really, really well. I like the shapes, and this is one of my favorites. Here's another one I did of the figure, and this one also one of my favorites as well. The strong edges of this well-defined rectangular prism against the smooth gradients of the figure. The contrast in the shadow types is a lot of fun to work with. So as you experiment with this and try different shapes and different objects, you'll find things that you like more or less. And here's another one that is also one of my favorites. I always like the ones with the figures. Here's a pumpkin. Now, all of these paintings I've done in the Evolve program that I talk about during my painting live streams. I won't get too much into it, but that's what these paintings are from. So you can see these paintings are rather simple, but sometimes simple is just the way to go when you're in the process of learning. So try not to overcomplicate things, because that's a tendency that a lot of people have. They see the finish line and they're sort of staring through all of the things that they have to get through to get to the finish line, and it can feel very overwhelming. So if instead of looking towards the finish line, you look towards the first step, taking the first step is oftentimes the most difficult one, but as soon as you take that first one, every step afterwards gets easier and easier, and before you realize it, you're at the finish line. So instead, just focus on the simple first step, establishing the light, identifying the shadows, and then pretty much from there, you're almost done, as I showed in the painting. So anyways, I hope that you enjoyed the video. I hope that this helps you build a deeper understanding of establishing light in your artwork, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Peace.